are the richest of the very rich. Billionaires they are, and they've been under a certain amount of attack recently. Mainstream politicians around the world questioning the concentration of wealth in the hands of just a few wildly wealthy individuals. But are billionaires really a bad thing? Welcome to Roundtable. Hello from me, David Foster. Okay, the idea is that capitalism's just gone too far. The central argument against billionaires, people worth at least $1,000 million. But doesn't mass wealth creation eventually benefit all of society?
There are 2,135 billionaires globally, and together they're worth $8.7 trillion. To some, these enormous numbers are admirable, but a growing movement among progressive politicians, such as US presidential candidates Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren, and Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, are starting to question whether it makes sense for so few people to have so much. Across the Atlantic, polling has suggested that the UK Labour Party's anti-billionaire sentiment is shared by the public, with 51% believing that there should be no billionaires under any circumstances. To put the maths into context, the average annual salary in the UK is $43,000. Jeff Bezos, the owner of Amazon, earns that amount in 35 seconds. Advocates of the free market believe that billionaires create wealth and jobs, and cracking down on them would create incentives for tax avoidance and tax evasion. But critics argue that such extreme wealth is the result of exploitation that entrenches inequality and can buy political influence. So is it time to take a ban on billionaires seriously?
Very pleased to say that joining us from Washington, D.C., we have Stan Voig, a resident scholar at the American Enterprise Institute, with me in the studio, Dr. James Smith, author of Other People's Politics, Populism to Corbynism, and Dr. Christoph Schuringer, lecturer in philosophy at the New College of the Humanities in London. Great to have you all with us. Stan, let me come to you first of all. Not all billionaires are bad people, not all billionaires are philanthropists, but by and large, I think you believe that they're a reasonable breed.
Well, I don't know about the breed as such. I don't think what should guide our public policy decisions is whether we personally like the character of the various billionaires that exist. What I think we should be worried about is not so much that there are too many billionaires. What I think we should worry about is that there are too many poor people. I think that should be our focus as public policymakers, and I don't think we should set public policy just based on envy or personal sentiments toward small groups of people that we may want to target with our public policies.
We'll talk about some of the policies of Democratic politicians running for the idea of the presidency a little bit later, but let's bring that idea back into the studio here. What have billionaires ever done to affect your life in a bad way?
Well, I'm 34 years old, and I'm part of a cohort of elder millennials, if you like, who will turn 35 next year and will own 3% of the wealth as a age group. And to put that in context, if you go back to the 1960s, 35-year-olds owned around about 60% of the economy. So
the economy equally is bigger now, therefore.
The economy is bigger, it's shared out naturally, but the point is that what we're living through today is not so much a policy failure, but a whole regime failure. Basically, in the 1980s, deregulation and financialization meant that states were incentivizing wealth to rise to the top. It's very tempting to think that there will be a sort of trickle-down effect from that, as was claimed at the time. But the point is that money, most of it rather stays up there. It doesn't get reinvested in the productive economy. It doesn't.
But billionaires own companies. They own industrial complexes. They come up with ideas that give people jobs. They do create wealth.
Wealth is concentrated in the hands of a very small group of people in a way that's unprecedented. And the fact that that wealth is concentrated in those hands means that power is concentrated in those hands in a way...
We're going to talk about power in a little while. I promise you we will talk about that. But the fact is they're not hoarders. They create jobs. And by creating jobs, they don't just keep it for themselves. They have companies like Amazon. They have companies like Microsoft.
It's true that they have a lot of wealth at their disposal, and so they can dispose of that wealth as they see fit and run these companies. But it's not accidental that working conditions in a place like Amazon are the way that they are. Amazon is a huge engine of exploitation. That's the kind of thing that it is. And if we're going to look at the way in which someone like Bill Gates, who I'm sure is a really nice guy, I don't want to criticize him as a person, but we're expecting him to make his own personal decisions about where he puts his money, which turns out to be extremely difficult. It's very, very complex for the Gates Foundation to know where to put money. And the question is naturally going to occur to us. Why do we think that it's people who have this special talent for accumulating wealth, which is bound up with all sorts of other talents that they have? Sure, you know, Bill Gates is a very talented person, but why do we think that that puts them in a position to decide how society should be run and where money should be invested?
Let's everybody come in on this, and Stan, say whatever you want, but I'm going to sort of counter that point slightly. You're not saying to them, you should be making the decisions because you have the money. It is they have to make decisions as to what to do with their money. Otherwise, it's just going to stagnate.
They only have to make those decisions because they've got so much money.
Yes, but then they are making philanthropic decisions. It's not that we're saying, let's go and find the richest person in the world and ask them to make decisions about other people's future. It just so happens that they want to do something with their money.
Well, this
in a
would be an
philanthropic way.
This would be an argument against somebody having that amount of money individually. I mean, if Stan is saying that the aspiration should be to help the poor, not to punish the rich, the point is that if you're up there with that amount of wealth, that amount of power, you're inevitably going to lobby, petition, invest in legal means in order to protect that wealth and power.
Yeah, Stan.
So there's two things I'd like to say. The first thing is in response to the notion that our generation, the millennial generation, does not control enough of societal wealth. I mean, that's, I think, a very separate issue from the wealth inequality, wealth distribution topic we're discussing, right? That's a question of, should the boomers be taxed more heavily? Should we have less generous pension systems? Things like that. Should we tax home ownership more? Right? Those are the places where that wealth is accumulated, and that's what explains the differences between the generations. Simply the fact that, unlike 50 years ago, lots and lots of middle-class folks own their homes, have significant pension savings. That's what's dramatically changed those cross-generational statistics. Of course, in addition to the hopefully one-time shock of the financial crisis. Then, secondly, what I would say is that I really don't understand the use of the term hoarding, right? Because that's not what's going on here. There's no one who's sitting on a pile of gold coins, right? What savings represent is, in the end, factories, production equipment, homes for people, all those things. I don't think that's often perceived enough, but someone needs to, postpone consumption today to finance all of those things that I think we can all agree on are good because they make workers more productive and they provide people with
What about the
shelter.
democratic deficit that we may be seeing here? You alluded to it. They can buy political power. They can silence dissent. They can pick up a phone and call a world leader and say, this is what we want to do. Perhaps that is something that we should be looking at in a little bit more detail, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, just to answer this point about the intergenerational thing, I would really say that the intergenerational difference, the intergenerational inequality, is as much a symptom of financialization and its bad effects as this kind of strange phenomenon of the billionaire. It's worth noting that there were 147 billionaires in the middle of the 1980s. Today, there are 2,000. Bernie Sanders refers to the billionaire class, it is a very new phenomenon and needs addressing as such. It's not just that in that time period certain people have started working harder, being more innovative and have got a load more money. It's been
But it's the wealth
model.
gap that needs to be addressed, not necessarily the super rich. Because while I've suggested they can buy power, silence dissent, who would you rather have trying to help Africans? Would you rather have, this is just an example, would you rather have billionaires who we know can help in some way, or would you rather have African leaders who pretend that they will and squirrel it all away for
Bill
themselves?
Gates has been criticised for sort of skewing and allowing his own eccentric kind of priorities and pet projects to kind of affect how wealth has been
but what
invested.
difference does it make, though, Christoph, whether it is Bill Gates, and it could be any one of a number of people, whether it is Bill Gates helping an African village, or the leader of that country and the politicians helping, when in many cases they actually don't, that Bill Gates could perhaps be more effective than they are? Is it a philosophical problem, outsiders helping?
Well, what we should be looking at is how it is that billionaires get to the position in their own societies that they get to in the first place. I mean, that's the topic under discussion here. Then there's a further issue about how should international aid be organised.
Yes, I agree with that.
Which we can deal with separately. But I mean, what Stan was just giving us, very interestingly, was just a kind of classic exposition of how capitalism works, right? We've been told that it's important that there are certain people who are allowed to remain in positions where they have an enormous accumulation of wealth and power so that they can sustain the means of production. But they have to be the owners of the means of production in order that other people can have jobs. But it's precisely because things are organized in that way that these people, this very small number of people, own the means of production, that we see the kind of phenomena that James has been talking about, which is that everybody else is forced to sell their labor power on a market that's more and more stringent and in which it's more and more difficult for those people to
But
make
it's been
ends
that
meet.
way for centuries, hasn't it? I would posit that it's been that way since the agricultural revolution.
Right, a very good reason for doing something about it, finally, at this point.
Okay, so you think something should be done. Stan, what do you think those people who would like to see changes want to see done? Do they want to cut down the tallest poppies in a field and just let the others sort of sit at the bottom, or is that inevitable?
That's certainly what it's starting to sound like more and more. And you hear that explicitly from folks like Bernie Sanders, from Gabriel Zucman, who's a prominent advisor to Elizabeth Warren. I think there are other better ways to accomplish similar goals. One way to do this is to help more people build up significant amounts of wealth. The U.S. has made some progress on that through tax-preferred retirement savings accounts, of course, through relatively generalized home ownership. I think those kinds of initiatives are a good way to address concerns that people may have that wealth is too concentrated in the hands of a few.
See, I'm wondering if it's just the vulgarity of it that perhaps offends your sensibilities. With a little figure here, there are 1 million seconds in 11 days. There are 1 billion seconds in 31 and a half years. That's pretty good being a millionaire, in other words, 11 days. But 31 and a half years, is it the vulgarity, the size? Is that what upsets people?
Well, I'm sure it's a useful bit of political rhetoric to appeal to a populace, an electorate, and say, look at how your wages have been squeezed in the last few decades, look at how you're living, look at how they're living. But the point is not so much the vulgarity, it's the fact that so much of that wealth is indeed unearned. You can't earn £1 billion. Bill Gates is a good example. It's hard to know where to draw the line exactly, but after a certain kind of launch of his growth of wealth based on his own innovations, his graph of wealth, if you like, becomes identical to that of somebody whose wealth is entirely derived from financial transactions, from claiming rents and so on. So in other words, even the figures who we think of as the productive billionaires, the people who have contributed something, become great employers and so on, actually the vast majority of their wealth has come from the unproductive economy of claiming rents, claiming interest, claiming money from these obtuse and baroque systems of financial transaction.
If I could just add to
yeah,
that, I think a thing that people often misunderstand is there's this notion that billionaires have all this money and it's their hard-earned cash. But as James was alluding to, and if you imagine that I earned £1 every 10 seconds, which would be a very nice wage to have, it would take me about 4 months to become a millionaire. If I earned £1 every 10 seconds, it would take me more than 300 years before I hit my first billion, and many of these people have multiple billions. So it's really not a question about people's hard-earned income. We're not comparing ordinary workers who are, take home a pay packet at the end of the day with some people who have just worked much, much harder.
So what do you do about it? Do you reform the tax system, or do you take the wealth and redistribute it, which is a socialist principle? Mm-hmm. Yeah, you're backing Corbyn. Do you do that, or are there other ways of doing it? I'll start with you first, Christoph, if I may.
Well, I see no reason why not. I mean, if Stan is talking about helping poorer people, one way you can do that is by levying a tax burden on the very rich that will increase revenue to the point that you're able to spend more money on lifting people out of poverty. And that's something that's been done much in the United States. Levying very high rates is something that's been very unproblematic.
But
there was a rate of 91%.
Have no reason to continue striving and making money, because there would be no point in doing so. So you end up without the money that you would hopefully hope to get from tax receipts.
Well, we're constantly being told that because it's very important for us to stay in fear of the system. But historically, this isn't borne out by history at all. In the 1950s, the top rate of income tax in the United States was 91%. During the Second World War, it was even higher, 94%. It then dropped to 70%. It's sometimes been 24%. There's no particular indication, and this is a great case study.
It is just a vote winner, isn't it, to say your taxes are going to be very low?
For me, it needn't be a socialist argument. In fact, it's basically just a sort of updating of social democracy, really. Nobody resents or feels that progressive taxation on wages and earnings is a sort of unnatural or punitive thing. That started in the early 20th century, but it started under a model of capitalism where most people's money was coming fairly directly from labour hours of one kind or another. That's not the case anymore. This is money that's coming from financial transactions that happen in seconds. It's really what we're describing when we talk about a wealth tax or a financial transaction tax or a land tax or proper tax on wealth is really just updating that kind of idea of progressive taxation.
So let's go to Stan. I mean, what are the wealthiest going to do if suddenly they've got to pay 99 cents in the dollar and they see those people way down the pay scale, perhaps only paying 10 cents in the dollar? What are they going to do?
Well,
run away?
I would say if you want to seize 99% of people's wealth, I think you can do that once. Of course, we've seen the historical record has a number of that kind of dramatic, revolutionary violations of people's property rights. I don't think their record is particularly good. Probably the most recent. Probably the United States has never seized 99% of people's wealth.
91% or 94%?
No, it had a high income tax rate, but that's very separate from seizing people's wealth entirely. The wealth tax that Elizabeth Warren has proposed actually is in effect an over 100% tax on capital income. So she's going farther even than that most dramatic historical example.
If there were that massive tax on wealth and it was more than 99%, as you perhaps suggest in the Elizabeth Warren case, what would people like Jeff Bezos, Bill Gates, Warren Buffett, what would they do? Would they quit? Would they say it just isn't worth it?
Well, what I think we would see is that people would realize that their property rights aren't secure at all, we would, of course, see a dramatic decrease in the capital stock that I think would reduce productivity, would reduce wages. And I mean, the notion that there is no historical example of this backfiring is just completely insane. 10 years ago, 15 years ago, Jeremy Corbyn and others on the far left were praising Hugo Chavez, who's the leader of Venezuela. I understand that people on the far left do not like it when you confront them with what has happened since. Many politicians on the Western far left praised him on a regular basis, but we now have 3-4 million Venezuelans who've had to fled the country. There is a widespread famine happening, and the country's economy has been destroyed entirely.
Let me agree with Stan, actually, on something. Let's put aside, we're not trying to solve the problems of Venezuela here. We're talking about Europe and America. Let me agree with you on one point, that I would also have grave misgivings about a wealth tax which took the form of a sort of one-off grab, like you're describing. I'd also have misgivings if it was being offered by a relatively conventional neoliberal politician like Obama, like Ed Miliband, the previous Labour leader over here, or indeed even Elizabeth Warren. My misgiving would be that it can't just be this sort of one-off grab or even this ongoing grab of cash in order to flood it into an unreformed system. For me, the point is not that we should sort of resent these billionaires or that we've got a problem with the fact that they're the ones who are employing everyone, they're carrying this tax burden. I would say that actually the aspiration has to be to create a situation where far more people are earning wages, which means that they can shoulder the tax burden. Far more people are in a position to be employers themselves. It's a democratisation of the economy.
Sort of board of billionaires, if you like, with the richest at the top and then 10 people below them telling them what to do and 100 people below them telling them what to do.
The important thing about Corbyn and about Bernie is that they are not simply proposing this wealth tax as a sort of one-off fix. Rather, it's part of a kind of whole scheme of having much more involvement in the economy and much more autonomy in the economy on the part of ordinary people. Ideas like automatic shareholder rights for workers, the
redistribution of responsibility.
Exactly, redistribution of autonomy, power, responsibility.
Christoph, where are we going with this? We're talking about the reform of the entire system. Mm-hmm. Billionaires are being bashed. Why the sea change in the mood? Because the headlines are everywhere.
Because I think people have an intuitive sense that there's a connection between the poverty that a lot of people are experiencing, and even in-work poverty is a growing phenomenon, and the way that the economy is run, the way that the economy as a whole is progressing. People have a sense that this system needs resetting. And if we're talking about Jeremy Corbyn's proposals, what Jeremy Corbyn proposes isn't particularly radical, I'm sorry to say. I would like to see something far more radical, but what Jeremy Corbyn proposes would put Britain roughly halfway up the table of European countries in terms of the kind of taxes that it levies on the super rich.
It's like Plato's one of your people, isn't he? In the sense that, as a philosopher, you read him. He suggested a redistribution of wealth being a very good idea. How many thousands of years ago?
Around
hundreds of years.
2,500 years ago.
And nothing's changed. So why is it going to change?
Well, Plato actually makes a really interesting point, which underlines the way in which the topic here really is the concentration of power in the hands of a few people. And he describes a way in which society might be organized, which he calls oligarchy. And that's exactly the thing that we're talking about here.
Did he think oligarchy was a good thing or a bad thing?
He thought oligarchy was overall, and he's not talking about the oligarchs themselves, it's a kind of deformed system. And the reason why it's deformed is that you get an association between the idea of knowing how to tell people how to live their lives, having a conception of the good life and being able to rule society, and the idea of having lots of money. And that's actually a complete, if you think about it, is a deep mistake. Why would you think that just because somebody has the capacity to accumulate lots of money, that means that they're in a position to rule society?
I'll have to come to one of your classes, I think, if I want to learn more about Plato.
You're very welcome.
Stan, 2,043 or $2,153 millionaires in the world, whichever figure you happen to believe, more than the combined GDP of 152 countries, 152 countries, possibly 2/3 of the countries in the world, these people have more money than them. It can't go on, can it?
Well, one is a stock and one is a flow. I do want to highlight that a lot of the new billionaires are located in countries that have very oppressive authoritarian regimes. Quite a number of them are in China. A good number of them, of course, derive their wealth from collaboration with a regime that has placed millions of people in concentration camps. I think a sizable number of the Russian billionaires derive their wealth from collusion with the state in a way that doesn't really produce any kind of surplus for the rest of society, the way, for example, Microsoft Windows does, as it is indeed facilitating our conversation right now. And so I do think that there are some sort of more sort of kleptocracy themed problems on this front that we should deal with as an international community.
Thank you very much indeed. Stan in the United States, Christoph, James, thank you very much indeed. Half an hour does go very quickly, doesn't it? Speak truth to power, somebody once said. Bit more difficult, isn't it, when that power is backed by billions of dollars, but perhaps that will change, although for hundreds of years it hasn't. From me, David Foster, from my guests, from the team that put this program together, thank you for watching. We hope to have your company next time. Goodbye.